Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. I'm your host, Alex Newman. We have a very special guest with us today. We've never had him on before, but I have worked with him before. He and I actually worked on this book here, World Federalism 101, in their own words and deeds. I wrote an introduction to it, and it's fascinating information. In fact, Rick, our guest, taught me a lot of this, stuff that I was not aware of. In fact, I don't know anybody who knows as much about this World Federalist movement and the Atlantic Union movement as he does. A little background before we bring him on. He has been studying world order strategy for well over 2 decades. He got a political science degree from the University of Washington, and then he studied international relations at the graduate level. Then he served as executive director of the Association to Unite the Democracies, and he has drafted numerous publications on the legislative history of the world government movement in the U.S. Congress. He's definitely a subject matter expert on this all and the Atlantic Union idea. He even hosts the Atlantica Now community on locals.com. By the way, if you go to locals.com, join the New Americans Locals account. We would love to have you there, and you can interact with our writers and all that great stuff. Rick, thank you for coming on the program. Great to have you. I want to start with the world federalism stuff. You know more about this than anybody I know, actually. And in this book, it's just, item after item, just stuff straight out of the congressional record, where you're showing that even back in the 40s and the 50s, these globalists were much more open about their desire to create a one world government and merging the United States and Europe as a means to an end of creating a one world government. I know you're not necessarily opposed. In fact, I think you support the idea of a transatlantic union between the United States and Europe, but more from the libertarian side of things than the kind of totalitarian globalist model. But tell us about the history. I mean, this is well documented, that these people wanted to build a world government.
Well, it's quite interesting. You have to go back to 1910 with the World Federations League of the New York Peace Society that was under the leadership of Andrew Carnegie. So in 1910, Honorary Richard Alpert, this one. I can't remember his name, but he introduced a resolution trying to create some type of world federation to achieve general and complete disarmament to prevent World War I. So after World War I happened, then that's where we started, transforming things into the League of Nations. And there's the League to Enforce Peace was established with a lot of these world federalist types, and they were really pushing hard for a world federation. And they saw the League of Nations as a kind of a stepping stone to a much larger, world government. And then the reality is the United States didn't ratify, the League of Nations, partly because of Senator Bora, and so then we just kind of went through, this into the second iteration of World War. But there was a man named Clarence K. Stride in 1939. He was a New York Times correspondent, and he was covering the League. And he proposed this idea of an Atlantic Union to prevent World War II. He saw that the rise of Nazi Germany, and he was like, well, let's federate the free and create some kind of a nucleus of a world federation that can expand peacefully around the world as nations grew ripe for it, as they adopted democratic principles as such. So that particular idea didn't spawn too well. World War II started September 1939. You started moving into the 1942, as the war was raging. The United States is in after Pearl Harbor, and you have Grenville Clark, you have John Foster Dulles, you have Clarence K. Stride, and the Atlantic Union idea being presented to Roosevelt. Roosevelt liked the idea, but unfortunately he had to deal with Stalin at the time, with the realities of the Cold War, of the emerging Cold War. So of course, everyone had to settle for the United Nations. That there's a lot of world federalists who were upset about that, and they kind of saw, they had to see the United Nations as a stepping stone to a much larger world federation. So right after, in like 1945, when the United Nations was actually established, Senator Glenn Taylor of Idaho, he went ahead and introduced the first World Federalist Resolution, after World War II. And things kind of germinated, once we realized that the United Nations wasn't going to live up to its expectations. Cold War started heating up. There was a lot of fear because of this nuclear war. And so the United World Federalist emerged, along with Federal Union under Clarence K. Stride. And what they ended up doing is introducing resolutions, in Congress to try to either transform the United Nations into a world federation, or once NATO was established, to transform NATO into an Atlantic Union, based on federalist principles. So that's kind of where it starts. Now, a lot of Strite, he set up this group called Federal Union Incorporated, and then with Senator Kefauver, he was a famous senator from Tennessee. He was working with the Atlantic Union Committee, which had Will Clayton and had former Justice Owen J. Roberts. And what they did is that they kind of pressured Senator Kefauver and to introduce the Atlantic Union Resolution, which was going to use the convention approach to create this Atlantic Union, to try to federate, create a true federation out of the Atlantic community. And so, the book that we worked on kind of documents the legislative history of the Atlantic Union Resolution, as well as the World Federalist Resolution. So the World Federalist Resolution was focused on going into Article 109 of the UN Charter, to transform that into, and use that as a kind of a world conference to kind of reform the UN. Whereas the idea of Strite was to go back and use the same approach the founding fathers used in 1787 to kind of draft some transatlantic union and have the nations of the world kind of, that want to participate in it, kind of ratify that. So that's kind of, so this movement lasted from about 1949 to around 1980. So, the first half of it was Senator Kefauver with the Atlantic Union Committee, and they spawned the passage of the U.S. Citizens Commission on NATO bill, which led to the Atlantic Convention of 1962. That didn't, germinate too many ideas. But then what eventually happened is Representative Paul Finley picked up the mantle around 64, and they worked, throughout the years up until about 1980 to try to pass this Atlantic Union Resolution to create this, convention to create this federal union that everybody was dreaming of.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was so interesting, and I learned from you, from actually working on this book with you, World Federalism 101, was about Europe. I didn't realize that the globalists in the United States had concluded that the Europeans weren't ready to join a federal union with the United States because they thought their little small countries would be kind of subsumed under the dominance of the U.S. And so the U.S. government decided, as a matter of official policy, and used the Marshall Plan and other things as a means to uniting the nations of Europe under basically a European superstate, as a means for eventually merging that with the United States. So talk a little bit about that history. And I'm really curious about this. Do you think this movement is still alive? Because we've seen the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. They want to set up these transatlantic bureaucracies, these transatlantic tribunals. Is this all an extension of that, or is this a new movement?
Well, let's just let me unpack that a little bit. Go back to kind of the Atlantic Union idea and the idea of European Federation. So there's like three different different movements going on at the same time. You have the World Federalists trying to transform the UN into a world government. You have the Atlantic Union unionists trying to create transform NATO into a federal union. And then you also have a union to say, hey, let's just federate Europe first. Let's use, they call it the dumbbell approach. So that was mostly J.W. Fulbright. Fulbright really liked that idea because he felt a united Europe could easily partner, with the United States to form a federal union. So that was kind of like a stepping stone approach. So when I think of guys like Nixon was Atlantic Federalist. He wanted to create a true Atlantic Federation where the individual was the pure foundation of that union. Then I look at John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, as a representative, he sponsored the World Federalist Resolution. But when he became president, he tried to introduce general and complete disarmament, but was met by fierce resistance from the Soviets. So he kind of transitioned over to the Atlantic Union idea, but instead of embracing the Federalist model, he kind of embraced the idea of like, hey, we're gonna go ahead and allow Europe to federate first, and then once Europe federates, then we're prepared to create Atlantic Partnership that could eventually spawn an Atlantic Union idea. So the federal, I think that approach was quite popular because in 1960, when the U.S. Citizens Commission on NATO resolution was passed, the Atlantic Union Committee, the members Will Clayton, Christian Herter, They became co-chairs of this, and there was a period there in '61 where there was a shift towards truly liberalizing trade. Dropping our tariffs to practically nothing in order to bring a lot of these third world countries, into the Western world. So we saw this gift, of free trade as a way of rising the standard of living in the third world, so they wouldn't be subject to communist infiltration. So that was really popular. Then when the Atlantic Convention of 1962 came in, all of these citizen delegates that were appointed by their national delegation, their national governments, they were acting in an unofficial capacity. But all they could really, their Declaration of Paris, which they came up with, really kind of drafted a more European Union-like type of function. And so after that, John F. Kennedy was you can go back to July 4th, 1962, and his Declaration of Independence speech, where he clearly says that Atlantic Union is his goal, but he really wants to focus on European Federation first. But what happens is that right around after Kennedy's assassinated, Johnson gets us into the Vietnam War, and when Nixon finally becomes president, the Atlantic Union idea based on Federalist principles, finally kind of emerges as a focus in Congress. It was very popular, but there was votes in '73 where they just barely missed a vote to have an Atlantic Union resolution. But what I see, my personal view is what happened is at that point is when the Trilateral Commission came into play in about '73, and it was clear that Congress wasn't going to pass an Atlantic Union resolution. It seems like what I call globalists truly emerged. These people who basically said, hey, we don't want an Atlantic Federation. We want some kind of a free trade agreement where we get to circumvent national rules and make our own rules. They don't want anybody above them. So all of a sudden, they're like pushing for a trilateral approach, with Europe and and with Japan and those areas around that '70s timeframe. So I don't really think that the Atlantic Union movement, in the sense of federalism, is active today. I think what's far worse is because when the Atlantic Union idea kind of died out in 1980, it really spawned neoconservatism. It really spawned globalism. This idea that there's no reason to have any power above us, and we can create this animal farm type of economic system where globalists are more equal than others, and that's kind of the world we live in. So when you look at the World Economic Forum and what they're trying to do, they're trying to extend their rules-based international order, which they draft the rules, and so the chances of a federal structure where people actually have a say, that can actually vote for people, is probably not going to come to fruition. So I see more of a global governance type of model where you have these nation state type free trade agreements that slowly and surely constrict freedom and economic opportunity for the masses, and just allow a very discrete elite class to kind of rule the world.
Yeah, we're over time already, Rick, but I have another question I really want to ask you, and then just tell us where to find more information, your websites and stuff. Sure. But you used to run with these people. As I mentioned when introducing you, you were the executive director of the Association to Unite the Democracy. So you ran in circles with a lot of these people that wanted to kind of tie the United States up with Europe and things. But and I don't know if I'm revealing too much here, but you told me one day that then you realized that these people did not believe in individual liberty. They did not believe in individual freedom. And so you parted ways with them. What do these people want, you think, ultimately? And then how can people learn more from your research?
Well, the people that I work with, good intentioned people, but they are globalists. They do believe in Keynesian economic theory. They are under the impression that socialism is much more popular than capitalism. So they're more socialist in their thinking. So I was actually, to some degree, kind of booted out of the organization because of my patriot past. So yes, I see them. And these types of groups are very dangerous because they're academic based. Everyone's hit with a good idea fairy. And they like widening and deepening things. I mean, so the more that they can integrate things and make suggestions on, well, NATO does this, and the OSCE does this, and the OECD does this, and UN does that. All they're really doing is creating more interdependence between these non-government organizations that are really run by the interests of people supporting the 1%. And so there's never a way for the people to rise above, these multinationals. So I think that most of these people behind the scenes, people I work with, truly want to, create a just world. But what they don't realize is that they're just patsies of a much larger globalist movement that sees their efforts as a way of just making, that animal farm, mentality, come to fruition.
Yeah. And Rick, what's the best way to find you? You have the community on Locals now, the Atlantica Now. How can people follow your work? Is there any way for people to get the information in this book? I know you said Amazon canceled you, but is there any way for people to get more from your research?
Absolutely. I set up atlanticanow.locals.com, and I'm going to be posting all of the material that I have on that website. So if people want to see the congressional record, they want to see the hearings and reports, and they want to see the publications that I've written and the publication that we co-authored, I'll post that on that website.
Excellent. Rick Biondi, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your many decades of research into this very, very important subject that very few people know about and understand. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you.
All righty, folks, that's Rick Biondi, expert on all things Atlantic Federation. Very interesting background. He's got degrees and other things in political science. Fascinating individual. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter. Thank you so much for tuning in, and keep tuning in. Go to our Locals too. The New American has a Locals account. You can follow us there. You can even interact with the writers. Hope you will join us over there. Thanks again. God bless you all.